Hey everyone, it's Reed. Before we get started, the union is on the road this summer. We need your help. Please go to jointheunion.us, hit that donate button, and send us a couple of bucks. Keep us moving, keep us rolling, keep this movement growing. That's jointheunion.us. And now, on with the show. Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm joined by Ron Insana, senior analyst and commentator at CNBC. Ron has been highly respected as a business journalist and money manager for over 3 decades. He's written 4 books on Wall Street and is a sought-after lecturer on domestic and global economics, financial markets, and economic policy issues. Today, he's coming to us from Inglewood, New Jersey. Ron, welcome back.
Good to see you, my man. How's it going?
Well, you tell me. We've got tariffs and we don't have tariffs. We have war and maybe we have more war. We have AI. We have uncertainty. Tell us, how does the otherwise normal human being in this era try and figure out how to navigate a very complex and constantly changing economy?
I think for the moment, you just keep pounding the nail until otherwise instructed. I mean, if you've got a job and things are going okay and there's nothing looking over your shoulder and you're not about to be replaced by a chat bot or something from artificial intelligence, you play the hand that you're dealt for now. Having said that, I'm starting to switch away from the word uncertainty because there's this hackneyed expression in my world that Wall Street hates uncertainty, right? And this isn't about uncertainty. Somebody actually put it better to me yesterday. It's about unpredictability. Right. There are so many moving parts at the moment that you're seeing companies and you're seeing individuals kind of freeze in place with respect to what they might be doing in the near future, whether it's companies hiring people or expanding or building new facilities, whether it's individuals taking that trip, getting on an airplane, doing something that they would otherwise, maybe not spend money on. All of this stuff is kind of starting to freeze in place. And having said that, the fundamental economy right now is okay. We're growing. When we get the second quarter GDP data, there's going to be a rebound from the artificial decline that we saw in the first quarter. So we're probably growing, somewhere between 1.5% and 2%. We're creating 130,000 jobs a month, although layoffs are going up, and we're seeing that in some of the data that are available to us. And it's not that we don't have tariffs. We do have tariffs right now. Every country's being tariffed at the very least 10%. Just hasn't shown up in some of the metrics that we look at, like consumer prices, wholesale prices, and that's because it's going to be deferred for a couple of months. Big businesses bought in a lot of inventory in the first quarter to beat the tariffs, and so they're sitting on a lot of stuff that they haven't raised prices on yet. Having said that, we're seeing some prices go up in some parts of the economy. And then we're seeing some prices come down because you're hearing from airlines, for instance, that travel is down. You're starting to see in consumer activity, retail sales last month were down nearly a full percent, which is an unusually large drop. So it's very much a mixed bag. I mean, we're okay. Everybody's just waiting for which shoe is going to drop first, whether it's the president, puts more tariffs on. We don't get a deal with the European Union. We don't get a deal with China. We don't get a deal with Japan or South Korea, or even worse. And I say this from a kind of an economic and disruptive perspective. We drop a 30,000-pound bomb on Fordow in Iran and their main nuclear enrichment site, and we get more deeply involved in that conflict. Oil prices go from $76, where they are today, to some higher number. And that begins to eat into consumer purchasing power because gasoline prices go up, and it feeds into inflation and makes the Federal Reserve's job all that much more difficult. Yesterday, they said they're keeping rates unchanged and they're waiting to see the fallout from tariffs. They didn't mention Iran specifically, but we know that that's got to be in the back of their mind, that it's a potentially inflationary event. So it could freeze them in place for longer than we think.
Let me just stick to Iran for a second because, we just got out of 2 20-year wars there. I don't assume, Ron, that we as a country, as a nation, can afford another protracted military engagement at this point. I mean, we will pay for it with borrowed money, but again, we racked up a lot of debt on 2 20-year wars over the beginning of this century. And then also, and I'm not asking you to be a military theorist, but so much as someone who understands the economy, is that Iraq and Afghanistan didn't have the capability to reach out and touch us, if that makes sense. The Iranians do. Now, it might not be a bomb, but it could be a cyber attack or something like that. And so, what other uncertainty does Wall Street, does the Fed, does the economy factor in, even if we don't necessarily see it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest question is, does it become a much wider, much more protracted, as you suggested, beyond a regional war? How do China and Russia respond to our actions? Do the Iranians engage in not just maybe a cyber attack, but they do have enough fissile material that's been refined sufficiently to create maybe something like a dirty bomb that they could set off somewhere, right? Then you've got a whole different set of conversations going on. But from a sanctions perspective, they're already under sanctions. They're already still selling oil to China. That's not going to change. But oil prices are set at the margin. So if you have a disruptive event, particularly if you undergo an effort to engage in regime change in Iran, and we don't know what the outcome of that would be. No one, I don't think there's even military experts who can predict what that would look like on the other side. That is a major global economic disruption that could send oil prices higher than we believe they could go. This is at a time when we have an administration that's getting rid of California's EV mandate, that's dialing back on investments in non-petroleum energy products and things like that. It gets to be very complicated. In the back of my mind, and it's moving actually towards the front of my mind, and as you can see, there's not much to stop it. You start thinking about the '70s all over again, right? And the ingredients that led to a better than 10-year period in which the economy became very uneven, and you had all these geopolitical disruptions, you had economic disruptions, and you had bad policy decisions that exacerbated some of the early inflation that we saw in the late 1960s that led to, inflation, unemployment, and interest rates going in double digits in 1980 and 81. So I'm starting to worry more about that stagflation issue because of the multiple moving parts that we have, none of which seem inclined to resolve positively, at least in my mind right now. It doesn't look like we're going in a good direction.
I want to stick to that for just a second because you talk about the 1970s and stagflation. I mean, Richard Nixon, of all people, I think, put in place wage and price controls. He took us, I think, off the gold standard, right? Then we had the oil embargo, and we've seen a lot of black swan events in the first 25 years of this century. But now the problem, I think, might be too, maybe it's not a problem, maybe it's just human nature, Ron, is that most of the country doesn't remember that. I wasn't alive. I mean, I was born in 1976, but I don't remember any of it. And so that's the other part. It's just when interest rates on homes, right? When mortgage rates went to what,
14 to 18%. Yeah.
but just recently, in the last several years, when they went from 3 to 7 or 3 to 8 or whatever, people were like, "How could they ever be this high?" And folks like you and my parents and everybody else were like, "Well, we bought our house for $11,000 at 17% interest or whatever it was." So that's the other part too, is that there's too little national memory or institutional memory for those times.
I've been arguing this for quite a long time. I have kids who are anywhere from 22 to 27. It's hard to talk to them about the '70s and '80s because it's a very strange thing to say, "Listen, we battled inflation and we battled, rising unemployment, and we had high interest rates." And you look at young people today and they're like, "Uh-huh." Versus my experience growing up, my parents were Depression era World War II folks. My mother was a riveter, my father served in the army, and lived through the Depression. And that description that they gave me was really stark. Even in their telling of it became very visual. And you were kind of not that far removed from it. Being born in 1961, the war had only ended 15 years prior. And, we were moving into suburbia. All these changes were going on in the United States. And now you have entire generations, really from Gen X all the way down to Gen Z, that has no conception of that history and the US involvement in a wide variety of these things and what it meant to go off the gold standard or what it meant to have an Arab oil embargo or a series of policy mistakes, the Iranian Revolution, which I was just talking about with my son because he was looking at headlines a little while ago and he goes, did Iran really just, bomb an Israeli hospital? And is this like the beginning of World War III? And, I'm not taking it back to 1979 when I was in Catholic school in California and we had a bunch of Iranian students who couldn't speak a lick of English because their parents were simply getting them out of Dodge after the Ayatollah took over, right? So, yeah, there is no institutional memory and no framework against which you can explain some of this in that context to younger people. That that the seeds of the '70s to me look like they're almost being sown again. The dollar's declining in value. We're not really coming off the gold standard the way we did in 1971. Inflation seems to be percolating, even though it's kind of calmed down for a moment. We're going through enormous changes in the structure of the economy, and now geopolitical risk has risen exponentially as it did during the Cold War. And it's happening in real time. And I don't think anybody without that, frame of reference can necessarily appreciate what's happening right in front of their eyes.
Well, I want to go back to something you talked about your parents and my grandparents. My dad's mom was born in upstate New York. And, what's funny is she was born in a house with no running water, no electricity, all that. So she was basically born in the 17th century, Ron, and she died in the 21st. And so the scope of change and the rapidity with it was probably shocking to them. But you could go back and see the home she grew up in and the one-room schoolhouse and all of that, where again, it could have been 16th century England or it could have been, early 20th century America. But we've done such a terrible job for ourselves and for our children and for one another of telling those stories, such that we understand, first, like how lucky we are, all things considered. But second, like how bad things could get, not to scare people, but to remind people that, nothing in life or anything else is a straight line trajectory. Everything is up, down, left, right, yaw, roll, pitch, everything. And I feel like we do a pretty bad job of preparing ourselves and our children for it, such that when, even from our perspective, things that seem small seem overwhelming. We're not building an institutional self-defense mechanism.
Right, and part of this is the fractionalization of media, right? So when I was growing up, and I'm too young to remember JFK's assassination, but, when Walter Cronkite was sitting in the chair and Huntley and Brinkley were on NBC, and Cronkite takes off his glasses and says, "The president's dead." This is a national event that encompasses everyone in the country, right? We all knew what happened at the same time, and that was true later with Bobby Kennedy and with Martin Luther King, and, we had 3 networks. We had this kind of unifying narrative that was also, looking backwards, as you say, coming from either your grandparents or my parents, a very stark description of what history in their lives looked like, what they went through, and what it felt like. And now you've got like our kids looking at TikTok or watching certain influencers and people who have no sense of history whatsoever and really aren't trained to talk about half the things they're discussing. And I'll leave their names off of it because I don't want to face their ire somewhere, down the road, and that they have 100 million followers who, suddenly hate me. But there are a lot of poorly educated influencers out there right now who make it very difficult for a younger generation to hear my story because they got guys who are talking just pure nonsense, whether it's about vaccines, whether it's about war, whether it's about the political structure of the United States or what's up, what's down, what's happening with pronouns, what's happening with certain marginalized communities. And so it's tough to have this intact narrative where you can look at your kids and go, look, this is what happened during my life. It didn't necessarily have an adverse effect on my trajectory, but I did pay 20.5% for my first car loan. I did have a tough time finding work coming out of college, as you are today. And we did, at one point, in my case, my dad lost a business, end up on food stamps for a period of time. None of this stuff seems to resonate with them because they've got this alternative conversation that's going on away from us on TikTok and on YouTube and among influencers and podcasters. And I think it's confusing to them because you can't get a straight line narrative across to a set of younger people who are just hearing all this other garbage that's not grounded either in history or in fact. And I think that's really problematic for us when we're trying to tell a story, either ours or our parents' story, which was truly profound. I mean, when you go back and, when I remember the conversations I had with my mother and father, my mom, lost her mother at age 16, dropped out of high school to take care of 3 younger siblings. Her older sister was in the Waves or the Wax, whatever the, female equivalent of Army or Navy was, and took care of her dad as well. Didn't go back to college till she was 45. Got married. My dad served in World War II. He luckily didn't serve overseas, but guarded Italian prisoners of war in South Carolina for the duration. And these were very, palpable, deep, and profound experiences that they had that they shared with us and talked us through what it was like. to not have certain things when they were little, to struggle and rent a house, when the lease ran out, had to find another house in the neighborhood to move to, and nobody was making enough money to get by, right? And those were really stark visual stories that we were able to kind of absorb and understand. It's very, very different now, and so, like you say, without this institutional memory, the younger generation may look at this and go, you know, "Do we bomb Iran? I have no idea." "Is it World War III? No idea." What are the, second order effects of this? That's not what goes through their head, at least I don't think, not yet.
Well, I mean, for my generation, I think of the Challenger, right? I think that's in my generation, we all know that. The first Gulf War, I remember exactly where I was when the first Gulf War started, and 9/11, right? I think those are the ones that for me stick out as the ones that are most sort of palpable in my collective memory. But I've said this before. I think the other part too for my kids, your kids, anybody really under the age of probably 30, maybe 35, is when I went to baseball practice as a kid in the 80s, that was my entire world. There was nothing else going on. Me walking to the ballpark, me playing, warming up, batting practice, ground balls, shag and fly balls, whatever, and walking home, right? There was nothing else going on in my world except for that activity and the to and from home. And even when I got home, right? Like I think we got cable when I was 11 or 12, whatever it was, but that was it. It was a very contained world in which very few people were, frankly, nobody was telling me anything about anything, right? It wasn't like, I mean, I lived in a political household, so I was in Washington, D.C., so we're probably a little bit more in tune, but, you know, being a kid back then was blissfully ignorant.
Oh god, yeah, and look, this gets right to the point of what I think populism is today, right? When you're talking about making America great again, there's a certain vacuum around that expression, right? What we're really doing when we talk about those periods is romanticizing our childhood. We are not romanticizing the period in which our parents lived, right? They had, pardon me, a shit ton of worries, right? I mean, they were trying to pay the mortgage. They were putting their kids through school. They were, whether it was public or private, their life was not worry free. Our life was worry free because we were going to baseball practice and, playing outside. I grew up in a suburb of Buffalo when I was that age. And, in addition to Little League, you'd play street ball or you'd go to the end of the street where there was a creek and you'd catch frogs and you'd come home and you'd stay out till the lights came on. And, all that stuff that we talk about.
I know it seems idyllic now, right? Yeah.
And it was. I mean, you're a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old kid. Nobody cares where you are for the entire day, right? You just come home to eat, right? I mean, you're riding your bike wherever you want to go. Your mother gives you a nickel, you buy 3 candy bars and, and you're good for the day, right? You're good to go. You're playing street baseball, you're knocking hard balls into your neighbor's trees. They're getting pissed off, and a really small ball of life, right? And that's what we remember and what we romanticize about the past, even though our past for our parents was just as complicated as the one we're living in now, if not more so, having gone through Depression, World War II, Cold War, Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK's assassination, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, civil rights, multiple wars in between, Vietnam, Korea. All that stuff was part of their reality. And we pretend that life was easy for them. Instead, it was just easy for us. And so, I think part of the appeal of what's going on right now is that romanticism of childhood, not of reality. And so people think there was a simpler time. There wasn't a simpler time. This period, however, now is becoming increasingly complex because of nuclear proliferation, because of artificial intelligence, because of a wide variety of things, the reshaping of the geopolitical landscape. Donald Trump keeps talking about 1870 to 1913. That was a period in which there were national spheres of influence, right? Where the US had its spot, the British Empire had its spot, Russia had its empire. He's talking about going back to that period.
Yeah, but remember how that period ended, which up to that time was the bloodiest war humanity had ever known.
Yeah, 2 world wars and the Cold War to follow with intermittent, wars in Korea and Vietnam. So, I think people have a really distorted view of history, and with that, they have a very difficult time making sense of today in some sort of historical context and how it may affect them going forward.
I just watched an incredible series on Netflix about Vietnam, and the marches in the street were substantial, but it's because there were at some point I think like 543,000 American military personnel in Vietnam. That didn't count the people we had in Korea, Japan, Germany. So it was a national issue, right? For the most part, there was a draft, right? There were plenty of deferments, but there was a draft, and so it affected in some way or another every American family or every American, right? Then you fast forward to Iraq and Afghanistan, perhaps 1% of the population is serving in the military, right? The rest of us get to live here blissfully. Those men and women are serving multiple deployments. They come home. They're basically, even up to now, the suicide rate amongst veterans is twice what it is, the average American. But the reason I bring that up, Ron, is because even in that period, Vietnam, a war 9,000 miles from home, was a national occurrence because so many people were involved, right? 58,000 Americans died in that war. I think it's something like 6,000, 7,000 Americans died between two wars that took 20 years. And so it was a lot easier for the average American who had no connection to the military. Maybe I had plenty of friends that served over there, but no family members, to say, well, that's something we feel bad. It's awful. We want it to end. But it didn't have that personal impact, I think, on most people.
There's no draft. It's all volunteer army. So listen, my brother, my older brother, who's turning 70 in a few months, went from 4F to 1A when he graduated high school in 1973. Now, granted, he was going to go to college and end up with a deferment and all that, but everybody's parents were terrified that their kids were going to be sent to Vietnam, right? And yeah, I was trying to explain this to my son the other day because of this proliferation of information services, for lack of a better description. During the Vietnam War, when I was a kid, yes, the film was delayed because they were actually shooting events in Vietnam on film, and it took a while to process that and deliver it back to the United States. But when we sat down at 6 or 6:30 every night and turned the news on, whatever channel you're watching, you're seeing kids coming home in body bags. It was very palpable, and it was a national experience. The narrative was uniform across the country, and so everybody experienced the same thing at the same time, whereas today, this fractured, media landscape that we have gives you an alternative view of what would otherwise be a relatively straightforward story. So when we talk about the economy and, and I try to go as fact-based as I can about it, there are other people saying different things and really clouding the picture. And that's true about geopolitics. I mean, CNN today, and this blows my mind, and somebody commented about it, making a disparaging remark about CNN, but they played a clip of comedian Theo Von opining on whether or not we should get involved in Iran. I was staring at the TV. I'm like, who gives a shit what Theo Von thinks about our policy towards Iran? He may be a funny comedian. He's not my cup of tea, but any more than I listen to Joe Rogan about vaccines, or Bobby Kennedy for that matter. I mean, why do I care? And why are they getting airtime to talk about these extremely complex issues that, look, everybody's entitled to an opinion, right? I mean, but whether or not that opinion gets amplified, I think is problematic in this environment because we cannot create a uniform narrative that helps us understand what's actually going on, whether it's economically or geopolitically right now. And it's a really complicated period. I mean, I would argue that this may be as complicated as a period as any generation has seen, given the fracturing nation of alliances that the United States has held since 1946, that the economy has challenges that are unusual in the sense that we're starting to go into, we have a population problem in the United States, which this president is trying to solve by kicking people out of the country rather than bringing into the country. We have rapid technological change. We have an aging population at the same time. We have a potential fiscal time bomb that's going off, and they're talking about adding another $3.4 trillion to the national debt over the course of the next 10 years. This is complicated stuff. And trying to get people to focus on what's important versus what's trivial or whose opinions might be trivial is a very tall order, I think, in this environment.
For the Theo Vons or the Joe Rogans or whoever it might be, audience equals influence. And why does CNN bring it up? My guess is because they're hoping that some clip will get caught by the algorithm because they're just looking for people to click on whatever crap they're putting out.
Yeah, and look, I'm not dumping on them.
No, I think it's
thought,
totally fine to dump on them because if you've got, a Christiane Amanpour or a Fareed Zakaria, I'm not always huge fans of theirs, who are sitting there who actually understand history and they understand the region.
and have been in country.
and have been in country for many years, many decades, and you're like, well, we could take Fareed or Christian, but you know what? Theo's got a take. Theo's got a hot take on Iran. So let's go to Theo. Theo, what do you think? And he's like, I don't know, man. I just don't know that we should be bombing people.
I mean, I'd rather see Trey Crowder talk about it, who I think is that kid's a genius. I don't know if you've seen his stuff on Instagram, but he does these great monologues that are absolutely brilliant and, just nails it every time. And we've lost, as you originally said, institutional memory. And we've also, I think, lost to a certain extent intellectual honesty in these conversations about everything. Like when you're talking about, the budget that's in front of Congress right now, the Senate's just included deeper cuts to Medicaid, right, than are in the House bill. The Senate snuck in a provision that would benefit a private credit company to restore the tax haven status of the Virgin Islands. So companies that engage in alternative asset distribution and sales will benefit from having a tax haven in the U.S. Virgin Islands. This is something we got rid of a while back, right? Then in the House version, there's something called Section 899, which puts a tax on foreign purchases of U.S. assets. It's rather unclear as to whether or not that applies to U.S. Treasury bonds. If it does, foreign investors who own quite a bit of U.S. debt, Japan owns $1.1 trillion, China owns $760 billion, plus whatever they own in Europe through shell corporations or shell entities, if they get taxed on buying U.S. Treasury bonds and we're running, deficits that are approaching $2 trillion a year and a national debt that's headed towards $50 trillion over the next, let's say, 15 years, what happens if they sell? We're screwed. And that's in the bill. Nobody, we talk about it a little bit. When I work with Stephanie Rule or some of my counterparts on MSNBC, we bring it up. Is anybody paying attention? I have no idea.
Why would they do that, though? Like, what's the benefit of that?
It's all part of this MAGA stuff. Everything has to be US centric, right? We want US institutions or individuals to own US debt. Well, they already do. I mean, every bank and insurance company has to buy treasuries to bolster their capital base. US investors buy US treasury bonds because the yields are relatively generous compared to the last dozen years or so. But if the language is such as if these foreign countries are taxing certain aspects of, I guess, investment that affects the U.S., we're going to have a reciprocal tax on their ability to invest in U.S. assets. Look, I'll be blunt. This is the dumbest set of legislation that I've seen in quite some time.
That's saying something.
It's not a reach even, right? I mean, the bulk of the benefits go to the top 10% of all income earners, and the bottom 10% is going to be absolutely screwed, so much so that when they lose Medicaid, access to Obamacare, and food stamps. And again, having experienced this in my life, no one takes food stamps voluntarily, right? This is not something you aspire to. You do not aspire to, no matter what anybody says about people who are on these programs. Their goal is not to be on entitlements for their whole lives and living off the $200 a month you get in food stamps and whatever Medicaid support, which is not a cash contribution to you, right? If you're on Medicaid, it's coverage. It's not cash. And so the notion that they're going to hammer 40 plus million people so that Elon Musk or somebody else can get a tax break or some firm can get a tax haven reestablished in the U.S. Virgin Islands, to me seems to be one of the worst pieces of legislation I've seen from an economic perspective, because all it's going to do is really harm people at a time when the future growth of our economy is in question, whether or not we're going to continue to grow or slip into recession. Inflation may take a bigger bite out of people's paychecks. And here we are talking about, just hammering those least among us who can afford to get by.
It's not even immoral, it's amoral. But let me add another piece to that, which is, and I wrote a piece about this on my Substack, blatant plug, the home front, about the fact that, Ron, we're going to spend $1 trillion over the next 10 years upgrading and modernizing our nuclear weapons stockpile. $1 trillion, right? Again, $1 trillion we don't have to spend on programs we don't need even half of, on something that's sole purpose is to extinguish human life. I mean, I'm not entirely sure that you can find a worse way to spend $1 trillion, not to mention the fact that the first like 300 billion or something is because Raytheon or whichever company's missile is like 12 years overdue and 38% over budget, right? Like, it's the worst possible example of, oh, did you know? I didn't know this, Ron, until I wrote the piece. that the nuclear missile industry has its own think tank. It has its own advocacy arm in Washington, D.C. Like, if that doesn't tell you what you need to know about where we are, I'm not sure what does.
It's a complex question because there's no doubt that China is ramping up its nuclear capabilities. It's no, Russia. Look, the only reason we talk to Russia is that they have nuclear weapons.
No, they're a gas station with nukes. That's it.
Yeah. What is it, 18 countries have nuclear weapons, right? And you've got India and Pakistan. I don't know if this is really offensive, but George Carlin years ago made a joke about India and Pakistan having nuclear weapons where, from a religious standpoint, one group believes they're coming back for another life and the other one believes they're going to heaven to collect on martyrdom. There's no worse combination to have, two groups of people with nuclear weapons who hold those beliefs simultaneously, right? It's like, it's a combustible mix. But you've got quite a number of countries that do have nuclear weapons, and what do you do about that? I mean, if it were another president, you might see real activity towards nuclear nonproliferation. When I was younger, I wasn't a fan of Ronald Reagan's. When I look back now, and this happens obviously with the benefit of hindsight and age and experience and maybe a little bit of wisdom, his conversations with Mikhail Gorbachev to reduce nuclear stockpiles, was extremely important. And both Bushes and Clinton and others worked on this, Obama, and now we're abandoning that altogether. When, if Iran were to get, a nuke, you're adding another country to the mix. Everybody's moving in the same direction at the same time. And Warren Buffett years ago said, somebody's going to use one, right? I mean, and so we're building out our nuclear capacity. China's building out its nuclear capacity. You get to the point at which where if there's an unsolvable military problem, somebody's going to use one of these things. So non-proliferation would be the preferable course.
Right. But I mean, we have 3,800 of them, right? Like,
It doesn't take too many, right?
no, I mean, that's my point. Is like, you don't need a lot to make your point. You don't need a lot to really end life as we know it. That's my broader point. Is you're spending a lot of money we don't have on something that you can do far more efficiently than just saying, okay, well, we've got 3,800 of these things and we got to fix every last one of them.
Let's step away from the defense budget for a minute, which, is, always fails its audit. We're going to spend $1 trillion on defense, annually going forward in these budgets. And then you've got, the issues of Social Security and Medicare. When you go back to 2010, when Alan Simpson, the late Alan Simpson, great senator from Wyoming, wonderful human being, Erskine Bowles, who was Bill Clinton's chief of staff, great guy. When they came out with the Simpson-Bowles report, they had a very intelligent framework in which to reduce deficits, make investments in infrastructure and education, and address the entitlement issue, which now they've moved up Social Security's insolvency date to 2034. We stopped taxing people at 160 some thousand dollars for Social Security payments that are put in both by employers and by individuals. Take the cap off. Take the cap off, and you'll increase the solvency of Social Security exponentially, right? Alter the retirement age because look, they already did it to me, right? I mean, as a tail end baby boomer, my retirement age was supposed to be 65. It's 67, and I can draw a much larger check if I wait till I'm 70 to start taking Social Security. So if you assume, rightly so, I think, that the next several generations are going to have longer lifespans than we do, moving that retirement age to 70 would not be a critical thing. Like I say, in 1983, they changed the retirement age when I was 22. I don't even think I noticed. I don't even think I cared.
Well, and it's not like you have to do it today. You could be like, as of 2035, we're going to do this.
Yeah, you do it for future generations. You're not going to do it for somebody who's about to, draw, right? I mean, but we're not having any of these conversations, and our news media is not holding these conversations on a consistent, frequent basis in which we're hammering these points home. And these are the most important things that are facing us. And you get Theo Von commenting on Iran. Why Theo Von? Find people who are experts in these fields to talk about how we can reshape our economic priorities, how we can right size our budgets, and we can do it in a gradual and intelligent fashion to ward off a future crisis. These are not the conversations that we're having. And we're so distracted by all this crap that's out there, whether it's on TikTok, whether it's, and look, I use social media as we all do. And I love seeing comedy clips come up in my Instagram feed, just, for giggles and for a little nostalgia. If I see the late Robin Williams pop up with a routine, it's great. I'll watch it. But the rest of the zone is being, as Steve Bannon said, is being flooded with excrement, and it's really, literally altering terms of debate, and it's keeping us from making, I think, informed, intelligent decisions. First, for me, about the economy going forward, and then beyond that, our international alliances, our geopolitics, and really where this world is headed. This very, very complex world is headed.
Well, it is, and it's not likely to get less complex anytime soon, but we are always so happy that you come and help us try and explain it. Before I let you get out of here and get back to your day, where can everybody find you online? It sounds like you dare to tread there, and where can they find your work?
Yeah, I'm on the X, or whatever it's known as, formerly known as Twitter, the artist formerly known as Twitter, Instagram, not on TikTok. I haven't really figured that one out yet. And, Facebook, but that's just to maintain my Rolodex from people that I've known since kindergarten. And, and I moved around the country a little bit. So allows me to keep in touch. And then I'm on MSNBC quite a bit, particularly with Stephanie Ruhle. Tonight I'll be on at 10 o'clock Eastern. Catherine Rampell is filling in on The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell. So I'm there a lot, and I'm still, affiliated with CNBC. So those are my places. I'm not sure I answered your economic questions fully.
That's okay. We'll have you back. And when you do come back, Ron, we expect that you will have all the answers.
I will have all of them in order of importance.
That's right. As always, gang, you can find me on Twitter, TikTok, and says.us at Reed Galen, on Threads and Instagram at Reed_Galen USA. And guys, go to jointheunion.us. Get involved. I am in New Jersey right now. I'll be in Virginia next week. Guys, I need your help to keep this movement growing, to help people in their communities get involved. Ron Insana, thanks for joining me.
Thank you. In the immortal words of the older component of my generation, peace.
Peace. And everybody else, we'll see you next time.